In this video, I just want to briefly explain how to identify the outcomes when there's a tax placed on sellers and when there's a tax placed on buyers. A lot of this is stuff that I've already covered in class, so I'll kind of go through this at a rather quick pace. So the first thing we want to do is draw out a graph with price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis, and we'll be using linear functions for demand and supply. Suppose that I've got some demand function here and some supply function here. And initially, we've got a free market outcome with an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Now suppose that there's a tax that's been placed on sellers. And before I do this, we'll say that the amount of the tax equals T. Okay, just some amount. We don't know what it is, but it's going to be T per unit, right, per quantity. And this is going to be an excise tax. So while none of the curves actually shift, because this is going to affect the price for sellers and buyers, depends on the relative elasticities of supply and demand, so we can actually calculate the amount of the tax incidence on sellers and buyers based on the slopes of supply and demand. But for the sake of identifying the new price that buyers pay and the new price that sellers pay, I'm going to imagine that there is a new supply curve, this dotted line here, which is S with the tax, or S sub tax. Now recall that the supply curve is equal to the marginal social cost curve. And in a sense, the tax is essentially increasing sellers' marginal cost of production. So we're going to imagine that this new S with the tax is equal to our original marginal social cost curve plus T. Okay. Now, the new intersection point of S with the tax and our original demand curve, that is this point here, will indicate to us two things. One, the new quantity that is bought and sold of this good with the presence of the tax. And this line up here is the new price that buyers pay. Now recall that the difference between, maybe I'll just use gray here, the difference between these two parallel lines is the amount of the tax, T, right? And so if we want to see that this is the new price that buyers pay, well, what is the price that sellers get to keep after paying the tax? Well, it's going to be this point and continue down minus the amount of the tax. And so that this new line that I've just drawn, this new price line, is the price that sellers receive. So, now that we've got all of this written out, let's examine some things here first. So, I'm going to label a few spots here. So, one, maybe I'll do this in gray again. This amount here, PB minus the original equilibrium price, is equal to the per unit amount of the tax that buyers pay. So maybe I'll put tax BB, tax sub B. This amount, which is the equilibrium price minus the price that sellers receive, is the per unit amount of tax paid by sellers. And what is the total amount? So let's say maybe down here, total amount of tax paid by buyers. That's going to equal the new amount that we just found, PB minus E sub P, multiplied by the quantity that buyers pay with the tax. In other words, I'll highlight this area in green. Okay, this amount in green is this. Well, let me see. Actually, I'll highlight it as this rectangle. Okay? And let's see, I'm running out of room here, but the total amount of tax paid by the sellers is going to equal the per unit amount that they pay multiplied times Q sub tax, which is in yellow this area, this rectangle. Okay? Maybe we can call this, well, we'll get to that in just a second. Okay. So originally, the consumer surplus was this entire upper triangle. And the producer surplus was this original triangle here, this triangle down there. Okay. So the new consumer surplus will be the area of this triangle here. Okay, we'll call that A. The total amount of producer surplus is going to be this new lower triangle here. We'll call this area D. Area B, this rectangle, is the total amount paid by buyers, and this rectangle, total amount paid by sellers. And maybe I'll do it in this lighter color blue. This triangle, we'll call this area E, is the deadweight loss that results primarily to consumers, right? This is a loss of consumer surplus. And this triangle here, call this area F, is the total amount of producer surplus that's lost in this market. Of course, the old consumer surplus, maybe consumer surplus 1, was equal to A plus B plus E. And the original producer surplus was C plus D plus F. The new consumer surplus is just A, and the new producer surplus just D. The total amount, maybe I'll do this in, I don't know, orange. Well, that's probably too close, maybe brown. The total amount of the tax revenue, which is a sort of government surplus or a surplus to government, total amount of tax revenue equals B plus C. And finally, the total amount of deadweight loss that results from the tax is equal to areas E plus F. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is show this outcome as a tax on buyers. So once again, draw my supply and demand curves. Okay. With an original equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Now originally, this entire upper triangle, I'll just call this, well, let me not call it anything right now, but this area here is the original consumer surplus. This area here, the original producer surplus. Okay, I'll erase those. Whoops. Just so you know, I guess it won't let me erase that now. So I'll have to erase this by hand. Okay. Sometimes this software doesn't work as well as I'd like it to, but that's okay. All right, so if we're placing a tax on buyers in the market and the demand curve is the marginal social benefit curve, then how I want us to think about a tax on consumers or on buyers is that this tax is equal to the marginal social benefit that consumers were receiving for each quantity minus the amount of the tax. And again, our tax is just equal to some t. And so the difference between these two parallel lines is the amount of the tax, t. All right. Now, the only difference here between what we did before, now we're going to imagine that the size of the tax is the same and that the supply and demand curves are exactly the same. The only difference is in our approach. This intersection point of demand with the tax and the supply function will once again indicate to us our quantity with the tax. And this intersection point tells us the price that sellers receive when they sell this good. If I continue up along that quantity line, then I'm going to get the price that buyers pay with the tax. And the outcomes are exactly the same, because it doesn't matter whether the tax is placed on buyers or sellers. Piece of B is going to be the same, piece of S is going to be the same, the new consumer surplus will be the same, triangle A, rectangle B, the total amount of the tax paid by buyers will be the same, the total amount of tax paid by the sellers will be the same, the new producer surplus will be the same, and our deadweight losses, this triangle here, this will still be the same, and this triangle down here will be the same. And so, just like we did before, right, all of the outcomes are exactly the same. And so the total amount of the tax that buyers pay is calculated in exactly the same way. The total amount of tax paid by sellers is calculated exactly the same way. Our new consumer surplus, our new producer surplus, the total amount of tax revenue, and the total deadweight loss will be the same. So you might be wondering then, what determines the tax incidence, right? The tax incidence or tax burden, right, shared by buyers and sellers. What determines this, as I've said in class and in the videos before, the relative elasticities of supply and demand. Okay, well, that wraps up this video. Hopefully that provided some needed clarification to you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me.